So today we're going to talk through cellular respiration. We talked about photosynthesis in class, and this is going to be the same thing. There's going to be a lot of information, and we're just going to run through the notes so that when we come back to school on Thursday, we can go through some activities that are really going to help us visually see what's going on, because there can be a lot of little complicated parts to it, and being able to visualize it, it's going to help. So cellular respiration is what is happening within our cells. We have photosynthesis, which is happening in plants to help them get energy. Cellular respiration is helping humans and animals get energy. So you're going to see a lot of things that look familiar but are slightly different, and we'll talk through them as we go. So the goal of cellular respiration is to take the chemical energy from food, which is glucose. So remember, your plants make glucose when they're all done with photosynthesis. We're taking that chemical energy and we're turning it into chemical energy that's stored in ATP. So when we eat the food and we add that last phosphate back onto our ATP, that's what's happening in cellular respiration. We're going to use carbs first for energy, but we can technically break down any food as a source. And the chemical equation is our C6H12O6, which is our sugar or glucose, and 6 oxygens are converted into 6 water molecules and 6 carbon dioxides, and then we also have energy in the form of ATP. So if you notice, this is actually just photosynthesis, but in reverse. So our reactants, the things that are going in, the ingredients that we are putting into the oven essentially, are sugar and oxygen, and we're getting out of it carbon dioxide and water. We don't say that energy for ATP is technically a product of what's going on, but it is being released. Kind of like how we didn't say that solar energy is actually part of the chemical equation for photosynthesis. Even though it's required and it is something that is happening, it doesn't show up in the chemicals because it's not a chemical. And most of this is going to happen in our mitochondria. So we need to look at the structure of how our mitochondria is put together and shaped, and it's going to be very similar to our chloroplast in our plants. So we have 2 main parts. You have the inner membrane, which is like the worm part on the inside of the mitochondria, and then you also have the matrix, which is the fluid around it. So kind of like how the stroma is the syrup to our pancakes in our plants, we have matrix fluid all around the inner membrane. So the first part of cellular respiration is glycolysis, which is when we're breaking down that glucose. So our glucose molecule is C6H12O6, and it's going to get split apart. We have 6 carbons. C6 is 6 carbons. So we have 6 pieces of carbon in there, and within glycolysis, we're actually splitting them in half. So you have 3 carbons going off. Fingers don't spread that far. 3 carbons going off in one piece and then 3 carbons going off in another. And so we're forming 2 sets of 3 carbon molecules. And that's called pyruvate. And it's just a fancy word for little sets of 3 carbons. Now this is actually happening in the cytoplasm, or the jelly part of the cell. So we're not in the mitochondria yet. But because it's in the cytoplasm, which is our jelly, it doesn't actually have oxygen to do this part of cellular respiration. So this is anaerobic. Anaerobic means without oxygen. And during this process, the act of splitting those carbons up is actually going to give us 2 ATPs. So it gives us enough energy to put 2 of our phosphates back on to an ADP, and then also 2 NADH. It's different than NADPH. So from here, we have to make a decision. If the cell has oxygen, so like our cells get oxygen because we breathe it in, then the cell is going to go through a 2-step process called aerobic respiration. So think of aerobic like if you're doing an aerobic workout, you're doing jazzercise, you got some cool sweatbands on and like some 80s outfit or whatever. That means that you're breathing to obtain energy. If oxygen isn't present, then the cell's going to go through anaerobic respiration, which, remember, anaerobic means without oxygen, and we call it fermentation, and that's how those cells get their energy. So from glycolysis, if O2 or oxygen is there, we go aerobic. If it doesn't exist, then we're going anaerobic. So aerobic respiration. We're going to take that little train first. The first part is called the citric acid or the Krebs cycle. I'm more likely going to refer to it as the Krebs cycle, but you could see it as either one. And this is going to happen in the matrix of the mitochondria. So we're starting in the syrupy part of our mitochondria. And we have our 2-pyruvate, so our 2 sets of 3 carbon molecules from glycolysis, and we are chemically converting them in the cycle to make 2 ATP, as well as some NADH and FADH2. We're making energy. So when we do this, we're actually releasing carbon dioxide as a waste product. So kind of how plants in their first stage, they're like pooping out oxygen for us to breathe. We poop out of our mouths carbon dioxide from the first step in this process. Then the second step is electron transport chain. Now this is also the name for the first step in photosynthesis, so they can get a little complicated. But this is happening in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, so the worm shape of the mitochondria. And what's happening is we have a whole bunch of reactions that are using electrons and the hydrogen that are formed during our first Krebs cycle when we're breaking apart all of our pyruvate. And here, because we are doing so much work to break everything apart and causing all these reactions, we're making 34 ATP. So earlier we only made 2 ATP worth of energy, and now we're making 34. And then we also have water. That's our hydrogen kind of bonding to our leftover oxygen molecules. So most of our ATP is going to come from this step. So this is important, and that's why with aerobic respiration, we're able to create so much. So here's an entire chart that's showing you the similarities between photosynthesis and cellular respiration, because this is how we get energy in our cells from the energy that photosynthesis creates from the sun. So our equation is extremely similar. It's just flip-flopped, and we technically get ATP out of cellular respiration. Photosynthesis is endothermic because we're taking in energy from the sun. Cellular respiration is exothermic because we are pushing out energy in the form of ATP. Then reactants and products are flip-flopped. So what goes into photosynthesis is what comes out in cellular respiration, and what goes out of photosynthesis is what goes into cellular respiration. It's just one big circle of life cycle. So the first step in photosynthesis was our electron transport chain, which is in the grana, which is our pancake stacks, and we're splitting up water and making oxygen. And then we go to the Calvin cycle in photosynthesis, which is in the fluid, which is our syrup of the chloroplast, and we're using carbon dioxide to make sugar. So from the Calvin cycle, we've created carbon dioxide and sugar. The Krebs cycle is the start of cellular respiration. That happens in the matrix of our mitochondria, which is our fluid. So we go from the pancake to the syrup in a human cell, and then back to the inner membrane. And we are putting glucose, which we have created into pyruvate, and we're making carbon dioxide. And then our electron transport chain for part 2 of cellular respiration happens in the worm part of the mitochondria, and we're using up oxygen and creating water. Now, there are some times where oxygen isn't available to a cell, and so that's called anaerobic respiration, and it's called fermentation, in other words. So there's a couple of different ways that we see this in our everyday life. You have lactic acid fermentation, which is different processes you can use to make like cheeses and yogurts. And then there's also alcohol fermentation, which is used to make alcohol. So lactic acid fermentation occurs in bacteria and some animal cells. So your muscles, when you are actually like working out and you can feel your muscles getting sore, you're actually creating little tears, and lactic acid goes in to fill in those tears. And so the pyruvate from glycolysis, so in the, oh my gosh, what's the word? Cytoplasm, there we go. So in the cytoplasm, when we split our 6 carbons into 2 sets of 3, then we now take those and we just convert them into lactic acid and that 2 ATP, which we got from splitting up our sets of carbon. Alcohol fermentation happens in yeast when we don't have oxygen. So the pyruvate from our glycolysis in our cytoplasm, we have, when we break the 6 into 2 sets of 3, we are breaking them down then into alcohol, carbon dioxide, and still that 2 ATP that we got just from splitting them apart. So let's look at all the ATP, because remember, ATP is what actually powers everything in our body. So that's kind of all we care about. That's what this whole process is for, is to get more of that. So through aerobic respiration, you're getting somewhere between 36 and 38 ATP. You get 2 from glycolysis, just breaking up your 6 carbons, 2 from the Krebs cycle, and then about 34 ATP from the electron transport chain. Now, anaerobic, when you don't have oxygen present, you're only getting 2 to 4 ATPs of energy. So let's look at this visually. Photosynthesis. Light goes in, carbon dioxide is going through the process, and we make sugar. Then water goes in, we split it apart, and we end up spitting out oxygen. So let's look at this visually. We have photosynthesis. We're putting light energy in and taking in carbon dioxide and water. We split the water apart in step 1. The hydrogen is going to go into that carbon dioxide to help form glucose. And then we kind of poop out that oxygen that's left over. We don't need it. We only needed the hydrogen from it. Then for cellular respiration, we take that glucose and we take the oxygen and we go through all of our processes to create carbon dioxide, which we expel through breathing, and then also water. And then we've created energy from breaking all of those different molecules apart. So again, we're going to go through this in another visual way in class tomorrow, but please make sure you have all these notes ready. And if you have any super outstanding questions, if you want to go ahead and email them to me or attend the Google Meet, or just write them down and we can talk about them in class. All right, thanks guys.